The issue of religious freedom has grown in importance for the Canadian Church over the last several years. From the saga over Trinity Western's proposed law school to the kerfuffle over the Canada Summer Jobs attestation requirement, to ongoing debates about public health restrictions imposed on religious gatherings during the COVID-19 pandemic, Christians across our country have faced increasing restrictions on our ability to live out our faith, even as we continue to enjoy the blessings of living in what can only objectively be described as one of the freest and most prosperous societies on earth. The other speakers that you'll hear from today are going to be discussing some of the specific challenges that I just mentioned. During this session, I want to take a step back to consider why Christians should care about religious freedom at all. Now, this may seem like an odd topic for what is, after all, a religious freedom summit, as is my claim that there's also a sense in which Christians shouldn't care about religious freedom. But bear with me. By the end of this talk, I hope to have convinced you that there are not only unique biblical reasons for why Christians should support freedom of religion, but also why our ultimate hope as followers of Christ is not found in the preservation of this freedom. So let's start with this first point. A biblical understanding of religious freedom begins with the acceptance that God has entrusted the state with a specific, limited type of authority. In Romans 13, Paul exhorts Christians to submit to governing authorities, affirming that there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. The state is God's servant for your good, Paul writes, but it is also an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer through the power of the sword. Those who do wrong will incur the state's judgment, but those who do good will be rewarded with the state's approval. From this passage, we learn that the authority wielded by the state is inherently coercive. The basis for this authority can be traced back to the Old Testament, and specifically to the covenant that God made with Noah, and by extension, humankind, in Genesis 9. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. All people, as God's divine image bearers, have been imbued with immeasurable worth and dignity. When men and women do anything that denies or threatens the dignity of their fellow divine image bearers, the human community has an obligation to prevent and, if necessary, punish this wrongdoing through the God-ordained institution of the state. Taken together, these passages reveal that the covenantal role of the state, as God's servant for our good, is not only to protect and avenge human life, but to more broadly orient God's image bearers toward loving their neighbors. This is to say that the state's authority is rooted squarely within the second table of the Ten Commandments, which Jesus himself encapsulated within the command that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But what does this tell us about religious freedom? Quite a bit, as it turns out. By its very nature, the state's authority is circumscribed precisely because this authority is coercive. But the gospel of salvation, as an unmerited expression of God's goodness and mercy, is inherently non-coercive. As Paul explains in Ephesians 2, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, and I would add the doing of the state. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his, being God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. In other words, our consciences as Christians are bound before God by grace through faith. And this means that the worship of God can never be coerced. The salvation that produces true worship is a gift of God. No one else can give it. Even the church is unable to compel true worship because the church itself wields a limited, non-coercive declarative authority. The Great Commission affirms that all authority has been given to Jesus, but the authority that Jesus gives to the church is to teach and make disciples, not to wage holy war. Christians can therefore rest in this conviction that neither the state nor the church possess the authority to coerce people to worship God. Now, it is worth briefly noting before we move on that Orthodox Christians disagree over whether the state has been given authority over the first table of the Ten Commandments, summarized within the command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. Many Reformed Christians, for example, believe that the state does actually have limited authority over this greatest of commandments. Such was the contention of John Calvin, who argued that the state does not merely see to it that men breathe, eat, drink, and are kept warm, but also prevents idolatry, sacrilege against God's name, blasphemies against his truth, and other public offenses against religion from arising and spreading among the people. Conversely, members of other Christian traditions, such as Baptists, have tended to adopt a more circumscribed interpretation of the state's authority. Under this view, the state has no authority beyond orienting its citizens toward fulfilling the commandment to love our neighbors. As the Baptist ethicist Andrew T. Walker argues, the Noahic covenant found in Genesis 9 grounds the idea of the free exercise of religion. Because God has not established civil order to seek out and eliminate false worship is to be tolerated. Thus, false belief is not punishable, leaving room for false belief to be exercised. On this point, we need to note that even magisterial reformers such as Calvin recognize that the state cannot prescribe acts of right worship. Let no man be disturbed, he wrote, that I now commit to civil government the duty of rightly establishing religion. For when I approve of a civil administration that aims to prevent the true religion, which is contained in God's law, from being openly and with public sacrilege violated and defiled with impunity, I do not here allow men to make laws according to their own decision concerning religion and the worship of God. Yet we must also recognize that the idea of state religious neutrality is, at its core, a conceit. All governments, as Jonathan Leeman contends, invariably pass laws that concern matters of religious conviction. Prohibitions against murder, as a prime example, aren't religiously neutral, precisely because virtually every religion agrees that murder is wrong. The public square, Leeman thus concludes, is nothing more or less than a battleground of gods, each vying to push the levers of power in its favor, which means, from one perspective, there are no truly secular states, only pluralistic ones. The rationale for religious freedom, which I've just laid out, is markedly different from the liberal one that prevails in Western nations such as Canada. Now, it's important to be clear here about the labels that I'm using. By liberalism, I'm not referring to a specific political party or some theological tradition, but rather the dominant theory around which North American political and legal institutions have been organized. As David Koyzis explains, liberalism's influence in North America is such that the central debate nowadays is not so much between liberals and their ideological opponents as between different kinds of liberals. And although there are multiple schools of liberal thought, they each share an underlying commitment to preserving the autonomy of the individual. Koyzis describes the basic impulse of liberalism this way. Everyone possesses property in their own person and must therefore be free to govern themselves in accordance with their own choices, provided that these choices do not infringe on the equal rights of others to do the same. If my proposed actions effectively violate the property another person enjoys in her own person, then I have transgressed the primary liberal precept and must thereby be held accountable for what I have done. This, then, I would suggest, is the difference between a liberal and biblical conception of religious freedom. While the liberal promotes freedom generally, and religious freedom specifically, to preserve the sovereignty and autonomy of the individual, the biblical rationale for religious freedom is rooted in a theology in which the state, while again instituted for our good, has been given no authority to coerce its citizens to worship God. For the Christian, religious freedom isn't then about our autonomy, but God's sovereignty. I make this point because I sense that many Christians, in their often justified alarm over the erosion of their civil liberties, are at risk of adopting a non-biblical rationale for religious freedom. Now, to be clear, this isn't to say that Christians, as a matter of political wisdom, are prevented from supporting liberal laws or institutions, including, I would add, those that I believe Canadians have genuinely been blessed with. Nor is it to suggest that Christians can't work in common cause with those who articulate liberal conceptions of religious freedom. Politically conscious Christians do well when they distinguish between liberal institutions on the one hand and liberal theory on the other. It's possible to affirm the wisdom of the former without uncritically embracing the latter. But what of my second contention, that there's also a sense in which Christians shouldn't care about religious freedom? I would suggest that there are two related ways in which Christians can ascribe higher importance to religious freedom than they ought. The first is when Christians assume that advocating for religious freedom is sufficient for maintaining a faithful gospel witness. And the second is when Christians believe that religious freedom is somehow necessary to preserve this same witness. Neither of these conclusions are true, and if left uncorrected, can prove destructive. This first error in some ways should be obvious. After all, we've established here today that there are many non-Christians who, to their credit, advocate for religious freedom. But as we've also seen, not every rationale for religious freedom is biblical. Similarly, it's possible that a Christian might devote their entire career to fighting for religious freedom, but that their life is otherwise fails to bear a true witness to the hope and truth of the gospel. This is a sobering reality for those of us who feel vocationally called toward religious freedom advocacy. And I would add that I'm saying this as a Christian lawyer who's had the privilege of working for both Christian and non-Christian legal organizations. But furthermore, as we've already seen, the call to discipleship and true worship can never be coerced. On its own, religious freedom can't bring anyone into a right relationship with God. At most, religious freedom fosters a culture of peace, order, and good governance, to borrow a defining phrase from the Canadian Constitution, in which the church can openly fulfill the Great Commission. As Paul writes in 1 Timothy 2, we are to make supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving for all people, for kings, and all who are in positions of high authority, that we may lead peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. When we lose sight of this truth, we risk turning religious freedom into a good unto itself, and even if we're not careful, into a sort of idol. Such an unhealthy preoccupation with religious freedom can lead to other errors, including the belief that without this freedom, we're somehow prevented from leading God-honoring lives. But Christians were never promised earthly comfort or freedom. Our calling, quite simply, is to take up our cross and follow Jesus. If the world hates you, he told his disciples in John 15, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Now, don't misunderstand me. Religious freedom is unquestionably a good gift from God, and it's something that we should cherish and, if needed, zealously protect. But the ultimate freedom to which Christ has called us is not an earthly freedom, nor is it an opportunity for the flesh, as Paul writes in Galatians 5, but a freedom to pursue good works and through love to serve one another. If it's God's will that we should lose our religious freedom in this world, this does nothing to take away our assurance of salvation or to prevent us from loving God and neighbor. Martin Luther put it well when he rhetorically asked, "How could poor health or captivity or hunger or thirst or any other external misfortune harm the soul when even the godliest, purest, and freest consciences are afflicted with such things? Not one of these things touches upon the freedom or servitude of the soul." Calvin reached a similar conclusion. "It makes no difference what your condition among men may be, or under what nation's laws you live," he wrote, "since the kingdom of Christ does not at all consist in these things." So, brothers and sisters, I urge you to take religious freedom seriously. And I hope that you won't take the freedom that we enjoy in Canada for granted. Listen carefully to what the other speakers at today's summit have to say. But above all, don't lose hope. No matter what we end up facing in the months, years, and decades ahead, our true freedom, our freedom that is found in the salvation that Christ offers, can never be taken away.